Hi there, I'm Richard Watts, and along with Claire Thurman and some of the rest of our team at People Make It Work, we're responsible for supporting organisations through the organisation development and fellows through the leadership development elements of the Western Jerwood Creative Bursary Programme. And in this short video, I wanted to talk a little bit about creating change within the culture of our organisation and expanding the change beyond the effect of the particular role that you're recruiting, and thinking about how we can make sure that we're making change in the organisation and not just changing the recruitment of an individual. We're going to spend more time on this later on in the year in 2021, when the organisation development programme moves from focusing on recruitment to thinking more about organisational culture and how we draw out inclusiveness within our culture, as well as thinking about how we bring that inclusiveness and representation into our creative programme and our relationships with audiences and communities, and recognise that all three of those things are really tightly entwined. Organisational culture, creative practice, and engagement practice are not three separate things, are they? They're entwined into the way we do things around here, which is really what we mean by organisational culture. So I thought I would just use a tool that we draw upon a lot, which is our 8 elements of effective change when we're thinking about organisations. And this model relates to research that's identified a number of things that need to be present in order for change to be manifest and move from an idea of hope through to a kind of embedded reality. And I thought it might be useful in this session to just touch on some of these. We'll definitely be looking at these and other models in more detail in 2021. And we'll also be drawing on your own live experiences across your organisations of making change happen in the area of inclusion and representation, and drawing on the lived experience of people within your organisation. But for today, I just thought I would apply our 8-element model to the changes that you might be seeking to make right now, in case that opens up some opportunities for action at the moment. So these 8 elements, we present them in this form of a kind of honeycomb, because we recognise that although we've numbered them from 1 to 8, they aren't really linear. They're interconnected and operate in parallel. I think of them in this honeycomb form, or you might think of them in the form of spinning plates. They are all required. Each one is essential, and they need to be all operating pretty much at the same time. But by unpacking them into 8 different elements, I think it helps us to think about what we might do about them. So the first element that we're going to talk a little bit about today is around leading our change. So when we think about leading change, I'm thinking that's one of the reasons that there's a trustee, an exec member and a line manager on this programme. We know that in order for organisations in their widest sense to believe that change is really happening, it needs to be led. Lots of changes fizzle out because it isn't clear who thinks they're a good idea. There's no sense of energy, direction and commitment from leaders, and therefore naturally people focus on the things that leaders are committed to and are evidently demonstrating leadership around. And there's never enough energy to go around, and so those things that don't feel like they have leadership support front and centre tend to wither on the vine. So when we think about leadership in this sense, I'm thinking of it more like a behaviour than a position. And I'm thinking about it in terms of three critical elements. First of all, making it important by ensuring that the resources needed within the organisation to make the change happen are apparent. That's a key leadership role, isn't it? Not just declaring it's important, but enabling it to be successfully delivered by putting the resources in place. That might be time, it might be knowledge, it might be additional people, it might be an agenda that creates focus. So the thinking about the leadership role at trustee level, at exec level, at every level in the organisation. How am I demonstrating leadership? By making the resources available to make the change possible. So it stops being wishful thinking and it starts to be nearer to inevitable. I think the second thing to do is to commit what pains you most. So we often think that in leadership of change, there's three things that you really need to give: time, money, and reputation. And whichever of those makes you wince most is the one that you've most clearly got to dedicate to this project, in order for everyone else to see that that we really mean it, that we're not just saying it, and that this is something that actually matters to us. And quite a lot of announcements about inclusion and representation related to Black Lives Matter have only been wishful thinking, haven't they? And they haven't been backed up by those three things: time, money, and reputation. So if you don't normally stake your name on something happening, then stake it on this, and people will sit up and realise that this is the time. If you don't normally give projects time or carve out time in agendas for topics, then do it for this, and people will know that we're serious. So if we're thinking about leading the change, there's those I've mentioned two of three areas: making the resources available, demonstrating leadership in that way, and doing what hurts you most to really demonstrate that you mean it. And I think the third is around role modelling, like being the change. So my role as a leader, and as I say, let's think about this as a behaviour rather than a position, isn't to call for it or describe it as something we should be doing. It's to be it. So in what ways have I colluded with barriers, and how can I talk about that and describe what I've learned and how I'm going to operate differently? In what ways have I created conditions that enable the organisation to exclude others? And what am I personally committed to doing to shift that? However good I am, those things will have been going on because I'm a product of this society and I'm a formative shaper of this organisation. And if it's not as inclusive as we want it to be, then I haven't been as a leader in it, as a member of the organisation. So really laser-like focus on in what ways have I contributed to the existing status quo? What can I declare and act to shift that? What concrete things can I do that enable others to see that I'm not calling on change to happen? I'm being the change and calling on others to use the resources I'm providing to also manifest the change that we're talking about. So that's about leading change, and it's the first of our 8 elements. Moving on to the second of those, it's about establishing a shared need. So I'm leading the change, I'm spinning that plate, and now we need to engage everyone, establishing a shared need. So it's an active process that involves multiple people. So we see change as a social process rather than a project process. So it's about listening and talking, exploring and involving. And therefore we need to discuss with everyone why change is needed, what's not okay about our current ways of working, and build collective appetite, create a disposition for change. And we do that by surfacing the problems that exist, the barriers that exist, the ways in which our current ways aren't working for us in the society that we wish to generate. So that second activity is a collective activity. It's not just going, I've decided we need to do this. It's surfacing. What are the costs to us of not being more representative? What are the opportunities that we're missing? What are the threats that come if we don't shift? And how can we collectively imagine how it could be better? So that's seeing our role actively in creating a conversation that builds appetite for change. And if we move on to the third element, we're now thinking about developing a shared vision. So it's really hard for all of us to create change without having a sense of where we're going. And if we're working really collaboratively, that might emerge, might iterate over time, in which case we need a clear sense of how we're getting there. What's our process vision if we haven't got a destination vision right now? Either way, I think in this context of the Western Jerwood Creative Bursaries, we're then thinking about what would it look like? What would a more inclusive workplace look like? What would a more representative group of employees, collaborators, communities look like? And we might also be thinking about how might we get there? What steps might we want to take? What's our vision for engaging with that idea? How might we be having conversations differently? So that vision piece for me is both abstract and high level. It's got a lot of hope and possibility in it. It's also quite concrete. So we're describing really significant shifts. So we might say, if we think back to recruitment, we might be talking, mightn't we, about what that advertisement looks like, how we've worked together as an organisation to strip away unnecessary conditions or requirements, how we've thought about the ways in which we need to shift our practices in order to hear more voices, to shape decisions, how we're aiming to distribute leadership more fundamentally. But we might also be talking about how we're going to present ourselves as an organisation to potential employees, and perhaps we're talking about what it would feel like to join that organisation. So that kind of visioning work enables me to move from appetite to a taste. I can taste and feel what it's going to be like, and I can start to connect to that and see how I could help to make it happen. So the fourth element that we're thinking about today is about mobilising commitment. So we see that change is done by people, not to people, and that all the changes that we're talking about making in our organisation in order to be more inclusive, more representative, in order to shift the way that we recruit and to enable people to both get in and get on in our organisation, all those changes are already someone's job. So our job in leading change isn't to look at everything that needs to happen and work out as one person what all the changes are across our whole organisation. That's exhausting, and it's not our job. Our job is to enable everyone who has jobs that need to shift in order for that to happen, in order for our organisation to be more inclusive, to explore, identify and make those changes. So if I'm responsible for the language on our website, that's a job for the person who's responsible for that, to interrogate the language we're using, to find new language, to implement that. If I work front of house and I might be welcoming potential interviewees into the organisation, how am I going to do that in ways that are more inclusive? How am I going to connect all the way across the organisation, whether we're talking about recruitment or wider changes around inclusive practice? There are jobs that need to be interrogated, there are mindsets that need to be unpacked. And all of that means that when we create change, we do it by mobilising everyone, our trustees, our volunteers, our leadership team, our middle managers, our staff teams, the artists and makers that we work with, because all of them create the experience of the organisation, and all of them will have shifts to make. So we're really thinking in this moment that that I like to think of decisions to make change as being kind of moments of activation for everyone. You could say, oh, we just need a new form, or we just need a new process. And if that's the case, you might go to the person who owns that form, or the person that owns that process, have a conversation with that one person about how the form needs to be different, the process needs to be different, and we've activated a transactional change. We've refined one thing. But our goal is transformational, isn't it? It's about shifting, understanding, building awareness, creating sensitivity, generating in everyone in the organisation a commitment to inclusion that means that everyone's working to that as part of their core role. In that case, we don't go to one person and talk about one form. We have a wider conversation about where are all the forms that need to change, and what is it we're intending to get to, and how do we collectively, each of us, choreograph all the changes that need to happen. Now, if we also recognise that being inclusive doesn't happen in a moment of time, but is a mindset and a perspective that means we're constantly iterating, constantly listening to those who are finding and experiencing barriers, and hearing that, valuing that input, and using that input to remove those barriers and to create an even more inclusive organisation. That means even more voices are heard, which means even more changes are required. If we're in that sentiment, then everybody needs to be involved. It's not about compliance, it's about commitment, it's about ownership across the organisation. So if we're kind of coming back to our 8 elements, the 5th one is about planning and executing our change. So these changes, we know that they don't happen unless there's a backbone to that plan. So it's all very well spinning a plate of leading change, and spinning a plate of establishing shared need, and spinning a plate of developing a shared vision, and spinning a plate of involving people in making the change happen. But you need that sense, don't you, of a beginning, a middle and an end. You need to have taskified this work, even if it's iterating and even if it's never ending. We need a plan, and we need to be monitoring that plan. And again, it might be that our exec or our trustees might play a role in overseeing that rather than setting that. But that might be one of the places where, along with helping to shape some of those earlier stages, they're helping to make sure that these things happen. So that's kind of seeing in a way, it's the sort of project bit of change leadership. It's the kind of most concrete moment when we're thinking about making change. So I wanted to talk about the last few elements that we're thinking about, and the next is communication, and then we'll look at aligning infrastructure and maintaining momentum. So when we're thinking about communication, like actually all of those elements that we've talked about already are about communication, aren't they? They're about listening, they're about applying, they're about mobilizing, they're about enabling. They're about sharing, clarifying, deciding, and all of that's good communication. Because we see change as a social process, it means that a lot of that communication needs to be 2 or 3 ways. So hearing, broadcasting, and debating, discussing, unpacking, exploring. If we want everyone to understand what the implications of the change are for them, what their sort of me-shaped change is, so not just HR, but everyone in the organisation making me-shaped changes that create a more inclusive culture, then for me to identify my me-shaped change, I need to unpack that probably in a supported conversation where somebody's holding on to the ideas with me and I'm able to kind of test what that might mean for me in my role. So that isn't an email that says, this is important, I've mandated it. That's a process of exploration and ownership. And that ownership and connection takes time and involves a more interactive sense of what we mean by communication. Again, I think that the board can play a role, the exec can play a role, the line manager can play a role, the whole organisation can play a role. Those who've experienced barriers to inclusion in the past can play a role. Those who are coming into the organisation and who are noticing things that we might have become slightly blind to, they can play a role. So there's a whole, communication is about enabling the change to happen, as well as talking about the change that we're trying to make happen. And the more that we can celebrate those who are already doing work that's inclusive and exciting, and then think about how do we do that all the time, everywhere, rather than sometimes over here. Communicating those stories can be really helpful for helping to build that shared sense. So there's just 2 elements that I wanted to talk about now before we finish, and that's about aligning our infrastructure and maintaining momentum. Aligning our infrastructure is about what changes do we need to make in the fabric of the way that we work in order to enable that change to be inevitable. In the fabric of the way we work, there are already structures and practices that hold and fix our current practices. So they might be procedures or habits or rules. They might be physical things like steps and walls, or they might be invisible things like how we come to agreement or what collaboration looks like. Who we ask, who we involve, who's on our list of approved suppliers, what rules we've got about what platforms we'll sit on or won't sit on, how we make decisions about our creative work. All of those things are actually infrastructure that have built up around us and sort of ossify and structure decisions and make fluidity harder. So if we want to create a more inclusive and representative organisation, we'll need to make changes in that infrastructure too. We might need to move some steps out the way, some physical barriers. We might need to think about the way that we describe jobs, the way that we recruit. That bit of infrastructure we've been thinking quite a lot about, haven't we, on the Western Jerwood Creative Bursary Programme to date. But that's only that's just at the door, isn't it, in a way? And all the way across the organisation, similar sets of infrastructure are in place about how we meet, about how we work. We need to make sure that when we're having conversations about change, we look to those structures that reinforce the status quo and make shifts in them. So that does include things like processes and procedures, but it also looks, for instance, might be about our board meetings. You know, the format of lots of board meetings is quite a middle-class construct. It's a bit like a dinner table. It's a bit like a business meeting. It's often minuted. It's got its own tropes and practices. Sometimes it looks like a piece of theatre, doesn't it? And we play our roles. So that's infrastructure that's embedded in our organisation. If we want to be more inclusive, representative, we might need to really shift how that works when those meetings happen. Who has a voice? How we make decisions? How we support people to understand what's going on, what we value, professional opinion, learned knowledge or lived knowledge, for instance, and representation. So all across our organisations there's infrastructure that needs to shift in order that change is embedded. Otherwise, we're like out of kilter, and we've said we want to be like this, but we're still locked into these other ways of working, and that won't last for long. We'll ping back to where we were, and we will have lost our change. So we need to manifest the change in structural form. And finally, if you're still with me, the eighth element that we know we need to really think about is maintaining momentum. So it's this one, of course, it isn't just at the end, it's all the way through. But what we know, don't we, is that change initiatives really often run out of steam. So we need to build that commitment to maintaining momentum right the way in. So we don't just focus on recruitment, we're focusing on the changes that we want to make across the organisation. We don't just focus on the fellow, we focus on recruitment going forward. We think about not just arrival, but the impact that shift in our organisation is having across our creative output, the way that we're making decisions and who we're collaborating with, the relationships we've got with communities. Like, what are all the things that we hoped would come out of this change, and how do we map that so that we can see it, that progress happening? A really good way of helping to maintain momentum in the early stages is to look for where it's already happening and celebrate those people and actions in your communication, so that we're not kind of imagining or presenting this change as starting from zero. We're building on the best that we already have, but we're seeking to implement that more widely and learn the lessons of that better practice in other places. And a bit later on, I think it's about noticing where progress is being made, promoting that to people so that they can see that this isn't an uphill struggle, that we're in a flow and that things are really happening. And thinking about multiple voices, making sure that if it's an organisational change, we're talking about involving and hearing from people across the organisation, because that gives that sense, doesn't it, that we're in something together and we're making significant movement. So I wanted to share this model to say, if you're thinking about how do I start to make a difference across my organisation, let's think about this change not as a single transactional thing, but as a holistic, systemic shift. And let's think about all the opportunities to involve people, to role model leading, to have conversations with people, for them to arrive at how important this change is across the organisation, beyond your HR person or team, depending on the scale of your organisation, to everyone, to picture how we'll be different as a result of this work in both lofty and concrete ways, to get everyone involved, board colleagues, SLT colleagues, artists, permanent, temporary, voluntary staff, to make sure we've got a concrete plan that's running across 12 months at least, because this isn't instant, and it doesn't stop with recruitment, as we know. To think about communication in this three-way version, so a little bit of broadcast, but a lot of listening and a lot of collaborative conversational unpacking, because that's where the me-shaped change comes. That's where my mobilizing is possible. Aligning our infrastructure, making sure that the stuff we've got in place, our procedures, our policies, and our practices are shifting to enable and realize the change. Otherwise, it's just wishful thinking planted in arid ground. We need to till the soil to enable those ideas to take root. And that means shifting the processes and practices. And finally, thinking about maintaining momentum. How are we going to keep that energy? Does it mean some sponsorship from across the organisation? So different voices and individuals are keeping it going. Does it mean regular meetings and activities? Does it mean a particular marketing and communication approach? Depends on your scale, your own culture, as to what will feel right for you. But hopefully that helps all of us think about ways to realise the change that we're talking about in ways that aren't just about distributing information, aren't just about sharing reports or talking about what you're learning on this programme or what another organisation is doing, and embedding it in the conversations you're having, because it's crucial, isn't it, that we get this right and that we all feel that we're making change across our organisations. Whatever our starting point, there's room for this to grow and develop, isn't there? Feel free to give me a shout at any time, ask a question in Slack, or get in touch with me personally at r.watts@peoplemakeitwork.com. I'd love to have a conversation with anyone around applying these ideas. We've got loads of tools and resources that support some of this work. And of course, it's also true that we're going to spend a lot more time in this area of thinking in 2021, when you've finished your recruitment process, and we're thinking more about the other ways that you can realise your ambitions around inclusion and representation. Thanks very much indeed.